2000s Disney Channel, my home away from home. It was the kids network I watched the most growing up, but that doesn't mean all my memories of it were positive. The Australian imports on our continent's feed were very mixed in quality, and it was kinda disappointing whenever a show ended after a season or two, seeing Nickelodeon and Cartoon Network's shows still mostly run for multiple seasons. Disney's animated lineup was more eclectic than ever though, constantly throwing new styles at the wall. Didn't say all of these were slam dunks. Brandy and Mr Whiskers is a show that's been kicking around in my subconscious for nearly 2 decades. I didn't particularly love it as a kid, and guess what? That much hasn't changed. But the more I rewatched, the more I remembered. There were little things about this show that stuck with me after all these years, and I wanted to figure out if that's a good or bad thing. If you watched Disney Channel around the mid-2000s when Brandy and Mr Whiskers was on, prepare to have some memories unpeeled like a sticky band-aid. You'll be quite surprised with what you were shown. The person you have to thank for creating this show is Russell Marcus, a name you would have seen pop up on various sitcoms in the 80s and 90s, ranging from the sassy to the saccharine to the sleazy. After becoming a producer on the last 2 seasons of Married with Children, based on the strength of his scripts I guess,
I mean, it is my fantasy. So now what do we do?
We have sex.
his first show as a creator was the short-lived sitcom for UPN, Family Rules, which only ran for 6 episodes from March to April 1999. Later that year, Disney would start airing some of their ABC Saturday morning cartoons on UPN, on a block titled Disney's 1-2. This might be a coincidence, but Russell had made a show for UPN, so that could be how he was able to pitch a cartoon to Disney. Production on it started in earnest in the fall of 2002, and it was originally going to look less anthropomorphic, with Brandy and Whiskers more resembling a normal cartoon dog and rabbit. But Russell would keep telling the concept artists to make it wilder and more exaggerated, leading into the final product you see before you. Helping him out was Timothy Bjorklund, a director on the twisted tales of Felix the Cat and Teacher's Pet, and Bill Motz and Bob Roth. Yes, that Bill Motz and Bob Roth. Production on a pilot episode was finished in 2003, but whether it was the first released episode, a rougher version of it, or something else entirely is currently unconfirmed. Not to speculate, but I could definitely believe this being the first and only Disney animated series to be created by someone who never worked in animation before. That development was all over the place. Brandy and Mr Whiskers ended up premiering on Disney Channel on August 21st, 2004, with a 2-hour marathon. To anyone out there who can claim to be the biggest fan of this show, was this enough? A half hour is already quite an experience, but a 2-hour premiere is a lot of trust to ask from your audience. Online discussion of the show wasn't very favourable from what I've dug up, but opinion on it has gradually simmered. It's not considered particularly great or particularly horrendous, it's just there. And it was there for 2 years and 4 days, ending on August 25th, 2006, managing to outlive Pluto by 1 day. But not managing to get to 65 episodes, and I mean, imagine not getting to 65 episodes. Disney has hardly given the show much acknowledgement since it ended, except for in one place. This is the Disney A to Z Encyclopedia 5th edition, published in 2016. You can rent it at the Christchurch Tauranga Library. Come on down, lunch is on me. They've got a full black and white photo of this show, but nothing for Disney Channel. Something's up there. Russell Marcus continued to work in animation as a writer for a couple years after this, but didn't create any more shows and fell off the radar around 2013. I hope he's fine with this being his legacy.
Well, it is our lucky day. Define lucky.
Brandy Harrington of the Florida Harringtons is a spoiled upper-class dog being flown to a spa resort, but on the trip there, she meets Buster Bunny before rehab, being shipped to a zoo in Paraguay. Through shenanigans, they fall out of the plane and into the Amazon, where Brandy has to adjust to a less glamorous life and take on the mantle of Mr Whiskers' surrogate sister because he's never made a friend before in his life. So there's the basis of a fine show, with opposites attracting and thrust into an exotic location, having to learn things about one another and the new world they inhabit. If they didn't make this location hell for one character and a playground of destruction for the other, and fill it wall to wall with gross out and sadism, it could have done pretty well. I mean, it still works in a cosmic sort of way, but who are we watching? Brandy is meant to be the most relatable to the young audience, suffering the biggest blow from this ordeal and struggling to cope without her owners. But she often gets into trouble for being egotistical and self-serving. There's a fine sense of balance to her positive and negative character traits, considering how dire the situation is at first, but she can sometimes come off as a real Oh, I get it. Mr. Whiskers was originally going to be a science experiment gone wrong, but I don't even think that explanation could justify how annoying he can be. I mean, sure, he's got a bigger heart than Brandy, but does little more than cause problems for people and wallow in his grossness. It's to the point where it's often implied he has no brain, the only one being a sentient raisin that acts like an old man who offers little help to his owner. I can't blame him for not trying to control something of a try-hard cartoon character. These two bump into a varied selection of friendly wildlife, including Lola Boa, a carnivorous snake who ends up being Brandy's best friend, and Ed, an otter who ends up being Whiskers' good friend. Lola is definitely a useful character, being more used to the jungle and constantly having to talk Brandy into doing the right thing, but Ed might be my favorite character in this show. He is such a verbose little geek, and one of my new favorite Tom Kenny performances. I don't ask much of you, my loyal viewers, but if you could all change your profile pics to Ed for the rest of the month, I'll be eternally grateful. I've got some rare Eds here for you to use. Cheryl and Meryl are twin toucans who argue like they're Phil and Lil of it, and sometimes fight like a bunch of good feathers. I don't know if they ever did anything, but I was quite impressed to see they were both voiced by the same person and not an actual pair of twins. Listen to them for a few seconds without getting that impression.
I wish I never had a twin sister. You calling me out? Nuh-uh. I'm calling you ugly.
Margot is a stick insect who offers very little at first, but by season 2, they'd settled on making her the mean girl, picking on Brandy and seeking popularity. That's one of her powers and or abilities according to the Disney Wiki. She's ironically become a more villainous character, but hey, she was part of more stories, so given a boost more or less. The show's main antagonist is Gaspar, a vaguely European gecko with ape henchman who initially wants to eat Mr. Whiskers, but quickly settles into smaller and pettier schemes for power. His self-appointed status as king of the jungle doesn't amount to anything in most episodes, so it makes sense that he'd wanted to. What doesn't make sense is why Whiskers and even Brandy keep buying into him for favors, but that's neither here or there. Last of all is Harold, a guinea pig Mr. Whiskers adopts early on in season 2, who hangs out in certain scenes until the end. He's a good boy. But what an odd bunch of animals. Not all that forgettable, but they all revolve around an unlikely pair that should have stayed unlikely.
I can't take it anymore! You and me so don't work, Whiskers. We're like water and oil.
I know. I heard the theme song too.
Ha ha ha, you are very funny.
If Brandy and Mr. Whiskers could be tasted, it would be a sweet and sour show. Sweet in the sense that they're trying to do this found family dynamic with the leads, and hammer in that despite their differences, they care a lot about each other and would go through anything together. Sour in that much of the humor comes from them not being compatible, Brandy being caustic and fussy, Whiskers being chaotic and messy. Why do they live together despite their differences? Because the theme song states they're like brother and sister. Perhaps this can work as a tangled but strong sibling rivalry, going back to that found family idea, but maybe ignore all the jokes about Whiskers wanting to kiss Brandy. That's one of the creepiest things about this show, and that's saying a lot. It always seems like there's some sense of unease, some gross visual on the horizon, some life-threatening situation the characters narrowly avoid. Their platinum hit of a theme song asks if you can avoid being eaten alive, but probably not because someone gets eaten every other episode. It's treated with increasing normalcy.
I can sing. I have a frog in my throat.
Hey, Whiskers. Hey, Carl.
The show also loves what I call snapshot gags, where a character will describe something, then click, a photo of what they're describing appears. Some of them are pretty funny, but others are just odd. And yes, they're an inch away from basically being Family Guy cutaway gags. This show also really likes brains early on. Talking brains, live action brains, brains snapping in two, brains all over the credits. A moment that's never left mine is in the monkey paw episode where Whiskers wishes that Ed was the brains of the family, as in the smart one. It turns him into a disembodied brain that gets eaten by piranhas. This is some grade A disturbing content in parentheses out of place. Don't make me use the scorecard on you. God, this thing is old. Some of this stuff is so out of place on Disney Channel that a year after the show started, they began airing this safety guide for parents.
Every Disney Channel show is carefully reviewed and given TV ratings to help guide viewer choices. Just the same, it's still important for you to keep an eye on what your kids watch, and together with them, make the decision on what's right for them.
This is like when one of your friends gets in trouble and your teacher puts the whole friend group in detention. That's not to say all the show offered was childish squabbles, toilet humor, and atypical cartoon violence. The dialogue-based humor is the type that works most often on me. Puns, lists, comments on the situation, Ed droning on about something. That's when you can tell this was in the hands of a sitcom writer trying to do a cartoon. Comments on the situation especially hit pretty well, because the stories are either straightforward or quite nutso. One episode might be about leaf boarding, the next might be about a swampy pool that gives Whiskers more heads. So given how unpredictable the stakes are, naturally it's relieving when the characters take notice. Fourth wall breaks were also more common than I'd thought they'd be. Before long, Brandy and Whiskers are completely aware they're in a cartoon, with Whiskers sometimes fast-forwarding or rewinding the show or changing the channel. These tickle me because it's fun to see a cartoon make these jokes before being meta was taken for granted, and it was still rare and surprising. Despite this very over-the-top and snarky writing, the animation is quite welcoming. The shapes are round and soft, the colors are vibrant, and the movement is very fluid and stretchy, some of the stretchiest of the whole decade. It's easier to tell it was animated by some of the people behind Teacher's Pet, especially when looking at the apes, but that show's creator, Gary Baseman, wasn't involved in Brandy and Mr Whiskers. Point being, there are design elements here that aren't out of the blue for Disney, although they tend to struggle with the gross out moments because that just isn't the company's wheelhouse. Also, I know Brandy's design is iconic, but I think it's a little too anthropomorphic. I don't get the sense that she's a domesticated dog owned by humans. It's like seeing Sonic the Hedgehog or SpongeBob as a pet. It raises more questions than answers about her owners.
You can't move?
Physically, no. But I'd like to think I still have the ability to touch the hearts and souls of millions.
Nope.
This is one of those shows with a very uneven first season, starting off pretty bad, but improving as it goes on. It comes from the leads being the sort of characters you need to see in a lot of action before you can root for them. It needs to be proven that Brandy can have her ego popped, and that Whiskers can fix his mistakes in bizarre but valid ways. They aren't too picky about what lessons are carried over into the next episode. You get a montage for each of them showing just how good a friend they are. Not everything sticks. Whiskers has a kawadi for a girlfriend by the end of one episode who's never seen again. But what are you gonna do? Write an angry email to Disney demanding they give Gina a comeback episode? Well, some early episodes were about Brandy trying to find a way home, whether by sleigh, radio, or Time Magazine's Coincidence of the Year. The writers got bored with teasing their dog. Brandy gradually introduces the jungle to human concepts like fashion, skincare products, and currency. But as soon as capitalism ravages the jungle, it always goes wrong. Virtually no story about money or commerce in this show has anything but a bittersweet ending. Combine that with the show's environmentalist themes, portraying the rainforest as a lush, priceless environment that man really wants to tear into for profit, and I feel like if this show came out today, some corners of the internet would nickname it PC and Mr Wokeskers. It's totally apt to address some of these concerns for the 21st century, that we take this free oxygen and exotic wildlife for granted. You may never see it in person, but watching it on TV is fine too, I guess.
Anything else to add, Whiskers?
Dogs and rabbits really can't talk?
I cannot work like this!
But they're still talking. After being teased in Season 1's Lame Boy, Season 2 kicks off by introducing us to a shopping center called the Mayan Moleria. A plot hole immediately opens up in that it's implied to have been around this whole time, and Brandy and Whiskers were never told about it, but all the possible explanations are pretty funny. This place is given quite a lot of attention at the start of the season, but they put more focus back on the rest of the jungle in due time, and all its new facets like concerts and water parks. Now that there's something resembling a society here, Brandy has no desire to go home. That arc is basically abandoned with very few mentions of it. Even their treehouse is more decorated this season. I guess it's nice she's gotten over her homesickness, but I would have snuck in a proper conclusion to it. It seems they can contact the outside world anytime they want, however. It's implied they now have TV and internet access. And Brandy just owns Peru now. Like, the whole country, in her room. There's dictatorship, and then there's being a Harrington. Although I favour the second season to the first, there are things it does way worse. Like, if the leads can learn to cope and change and solve the problems they create, why can't they start ignoring Gaspar? They barely think when he offers them something, despite how often he's endangered them, and while he's probably a hard person to kick out of your life, think of all the problems this year that could have been prevented if they just refused his help. That's the worst aspect of this season, but the best is Lola and Ed. Lola's given more jokes that don't have to do with the fact that she's a snake, and Ed continues to nail every scene he's in. Put them together, and you've got the most unlikely but welcome ship I've seen in a while. It could have been explored further, but this was already a shorter season, so I guess some corners had to be cut. Not in the animation department, because season 2 looks way better too. There's even more exaggeration to their movements and facial features, but it doesn't get ugly. They found the right balance. There aren't as many snapshot gags as in the first season, so less mixed media and more focus on how far they can push things. These adjustments can be attributed to the new storyboarders they brought on, such as Fred Osman, Katie Rice, and Tom Bertino. But we got an episode co-written by Jorge R. Gutierrez. Yes, that Jorge R. Gutierrez. In this 2-year span, the show went from a scatterbrained collection of wackiness into something more focused and character-driven. Although this isn't my new favourite thing ever, I wish there was a little more of it. A third season to tie up some loose ends and properly leave this cast in a better place than they started. Can you see the downsides to this era where every Disney show had a set number of episodes, possibly decided via dartboard? Great, now the show's got me doing them. Well, best I wrap this video up before I go mad. Here's a simple top 10. The Curse of the Vampire teaches the audience not to judge all bats on vampire stereotypes. Or does it? I like Vlad as an uncertain new friend, and think the complete 180 the characters do on him adds to the tension. A bunny on my back is akin to one of those cuffed together plot lines, only with tree sap, and a more figurative sticky situation with Brandy refusing to believe that her new ocelot boyfriend could have any plans of turning her into a carcass. Whiskers gets to be right this time. What is this world coming to? Auntie Dote involves the pair hiring a housemaid and getting a little too attached to her for her services. With where they live, it's no surprise they would get needy, and the ways they try to keep winning her favor stay creative. Better Off Wet rings a bell. Brandy becomes a lifeguard for the superficial benefits, not because she knows how to swim. I don't know if the staff intentionally lifted this story from SpongeBob, but comparing this show favorably to one of the very best cartoons of this era is a compliment. The Magic Hour might be Whiskers' best episode about himself, revealing that he's got a history in magic. Makes total sense, and it's nice to see something he's actually good at. Loathe Triangle might have the dumbest story on this top 10, but it has the best animation of the whole series, so it evens out. This thing is wild, when the story is as mindless as Whiskers and Ed fighting for Margot's affections and Brandy thinking they're fighting over her, it's gotta be presented mindlessly, with random references to the 22nd President of the United States Toadette for good measure. One of a Kind is the ultimate test of if Brandy had learnt anything so far, when another dog by the name of Tiffany Turlington lands in the Amazon. They share interests, but she's way snobbier than Brandy ever was, and reinforces that Brandy has empathy for those around her. Pedigree Schmedigree is about Brandy discovering she's a mixed breed and getting quite depressed over it, regressing to a mutt. We've got Whiskers doing everything he can to help her, and the most Disney Channel moral summary ever written, although I'm quite concerned that Brandy was more depressed over being mixed race than being adopted. Trouble in Store is where Brandy introduces the concept of money to the rainforest and all hell breaks loose. Whiskers gets a credit card. This does an impeccable job of advising you to be careful with your earnings, a lesson the characters never actually stick to. But this first instance is automatically the most valuable. My favourite episode would be A Really Crushing Crush. where Ed and Lola start to hit it off, and Brandy and Whiskers stick their noses in the blossoming romance. If this show had to come from the mind of a sitcom writer, I'm happy episodes like this take generic sitcom premises and make them more appealing with expressive and dynamic cartoon characters. Can't really say these bottom 8 do that. Paw and Order starts with a genuine mystery over who stole a bunch of doodads from the jungle dwellers, Brandy out of greed or Whiskers out of stupidity. Well, actually Whiskers' brain, who wasn't even a proper character yet, so this whole story was a cheap trick. Con Hair is one of many Season 2 episodes where Gaspar's able to swindle Whiskers through no effort, and by this point it was getting very played out and borderline out of character for him to be this gullible. Talking Paws is one of many forgettable tropey episodes where they invite someone to stay with them and they never leave. The only thing new to this take is the here we go again ending, so not a good new thing. The Howler Bunny was a waste of Fred Willard. I mean, I'm grateful he's in the show at all, I like his voice and all, but he should have been in anything but a display of how Whiskers is even more obnoxious to be around than Howler monkeys. Mr. Whiskers' first friend gives you a pretty bad first impression of the show. All the more extreme details are thrust onto you with no restraint, and Whiskers inflating that raft is the only reason I don't want to see him get devoured. Even then, it feels pretty manipulative to Brandy, giving her a bad new friend, endangering them, and just expecting her to start going along with them after the fact. Funky Bunny is the inevitable My Fair Lady plotline, where Brandy has to make Whiskers a proper gentleman for a big ball. It doesn't work. The jungle ignores all the effort Brandy put into the ball just to prove that Whiskers is fine the way he is, even though he isn't, as he's really not that funny here. Pop Goes the Jungle is a lot of things, namely annoying, but it's also a singing contest episode back when American Idol was on top of the world, a bit about Milli Vanilli fakery before they completely abandoned that plot, and full of Brandy singing terribly. Thankfully Whiskers skips the worst part, except he doesn't and we hear it twice. What Price Dignity? Cheap has to be the worst episode, there is no contest. It's about Gaspar having to pretend Brandy's his girlfriend for his mother, and sadly it turns out to not be worth it. What really shocks me about this one is that there has never been any indication that Gaspar is a teenager or close to Brandy's age. He seems wise and independent enough for that idea to never cross my mind. So a lot of this stuff is 100 times more disgusting if you don't suddenly believe he is a teenager. Now that I've got all that out of my system, what was this show? Probably something I shouldn't have been watching at the age of 4. It is loose and wild and dead set on its chaotic goals, but I don't know if it was all worth it. It's not a bad show at all, I've listed plenty of pretty good episodes, but this zaniness can often come at the odds of the vibe of Disney. I'm already impressed by what they were able to get away with, but I sense there must have been more truly startling content left on the cutting room floor. This thing is almost a 90s cartoon taking refuge in the middle of a different decade. Brandy's your only clue this aired on Disney Channel in the 2000s. Is there potential for a reboot? I don't think so, but the show did end with Brandy knocking Whiskers out cold for 50 years, so maybe we'll get a distant futuristic sequel series in 2056. For anyone out there who still loves this show, there's your pipe dream.
Next, he's the friendliest face in outer space. The animated series Wander Over Yonder is coming up next on Disney Channel.
Hey everybody! Want to learn how to draw Mr. Whiskers?